Yeah, my name's Daniel van Strien, so I am based at the British Library, but I'm going to be talking about work that we've been doing in the Teaching and Learning Working Group, as Mike mentioned. So I'm kind of talking on behalf of the group, but this is really kind of group work. And the other thing that I'll kind of keep mentioning is that we'd really like feedback on this review. So this is supposed to be a kind of initial draft, but we definitely want to get input from the community. So we'll be trying to promote this document quite widely. So if you think there's other people that would be keen to comment on this, then please do share it with those people. So as I mentioned, the review is kind of in a draft version now, and there's a Google Docs version of the review which is open for comment. So there's the link there, but Mike's also included it in the meeting notes, and it's on the slides at the end. Just in case anyone doesn't know, I thought I'd just give a very quick background to the Teaching and Learning Working Group. Probably the name kind of gives you quite a big clue about what it's about. But I thought in terms of the outcomes, there's these two kind of areas that we're particularly trying to focus on that I've highlighted on the slide. So this idea of trying to understand the kind of current landscape of teaching resources focused on GLAM staff, learning more about AI and machine learning. And just before we kind of jump into the review itself, thought it was just kind of worth sharing some of the kind of reasons we think it's even worth having GLAM focused teaching resources. So I think the kind of big one is, partly that GLAM staff will increasingly just be involved in these projects. So it's important that they're able to engage critically with those kind of projects. But I think there's also this lesson to be learned from other domains where there's been machine learning methods that look very good on paper, but when they actually kind of, I guess, touch the reality of a particular domain or a particular setting, they don't work as well. And I think having domain experts, in this case, GLAM staff, involved in the adoption of machine learning will help kind of prevent that. In terms of the review itself, we kind of did that in 3 different stages. So the first was to kind of gather material. So at the moment we have 28 resources that we reviewed. And then we kind of reviewed those against a few different criteria, and those were kind of developed as we went through the kind of review process. And then to make some recommendations based on that material. So today I'll kind of focus a little bit more on the final part in terms of the recommendations. So just to give you a sense of what the kind of review document looked like before we kind of wrote it up, we have this Google Sheets, which basically lists a load of resources that we found and then kind of assesses it against some criteria like the kind of length, the target audience, the format, etc. And as I already mentioned, those kind of changed a bit over time. As we kind of went through the review process, we kind of iterated a bit on what criteria we were actually looking at with the material. So in terms of the findings, I'll jump through these quite quickly, but I guess some of the kind of key points for each of these in terms of the kind of format of most of the material. As you might expect, a lot of it is Jupyter notebooks or GitHub repositories, so a lot of kind of web-based content. And then in terms of the kind of content covered in the materials, we identified some kind of key themes in the review, and that's something we'll come back to a little bit in the recommendations that we make. In terms of audience, the kind of majority of the materials we looked at were kind of focused at GLAM staff, but that's probably because we were looking for that kind of material. So that's not to say that that material is particularly prevalent in a more general sense. And kind of on the pedagogy side of things, most of the materials that we looked at were kind of shared as is. So there was some resource made available, but there wasn't a kind of explicit discussion around how that material was trying to work in a kind of pedagogical sense. So only 2 resources really were very explicit about that. In terms of training data, for the kind of materials that did include some example training data in the exercises, the majority of that wasn't GLAM specific, so it was kind of more generic machine learning data sets. And that's something we'll kind of come back to a little bit in the review recommendations. You've also got this breakdown in terms of type of data. You can see that kind of textual data is quite dominant in the materials that we looked at. Quickly on maintenance, we did see that quite often material was prepared for a kind of particular workshop and then kind of not made, not kind of updated following that. And some of the resources did suffer from some link rot, either with kind of URLs cited in the resources or kind of data sets that the material depended on. And similarly with some of the kind of software libraries, some of those dependencies have kind of gone out of date since the material was made available. So just some quick disclaimers before we get to the recommendations. As I mentioned, we reviewed 28 resources, so there's definitely things that we would have missed. And we do want kind of feedback on the recommendations itself. And I guess this final point is something where I think the kind of lessons from the carpentries and other organizations will be very important, is that I'm not sure that there's a kind of that much evidence yet for the best way to teach machine learning to GLAM staff, and that's something that we need to kind of keep in mind and try and kind of build up that body of evidence around how to kind of best do that work. And also a little bit of background. So probably most of you have come across these two reports before, which kind of look at machine learning in the GLAM or library sector. So what our kind of report tries to do is kind of build on those recommendations, because quite a lot of them have some recommendations around training. But what we really wanted to do is to kind of dig into not just that there should be training, but what already exists and potentially how that training could be developed in the most useful way possible. So the first recommendation is around getting away from all the material being focused on coding. So as already mentioned, a lot of the materials are kind of Python or Jupyter Notebook based. And while that's kind of an important part of machine learning, we think that there's a lot of other skills related to machine learning that don't necessarily relate to writing code. So I've listed a kind of list of some of those things here. But a lot of these skills like, documenting data sets or documenting machine learning projects are things that are not necessarily straightforward to do and do need to be taught, but don't necessarily involve coding. Another kind of recommendation we make is about trying to be more community driven or organized in how these materials are developed. So we kind of did notice some duplication of effort in the materials we reviewed, and there's also this kind of danger, as I said, of materials becoming out of date. And I think that's particularly a problem in this domain where both the kind of techniques, but also the kind of libraries and approaches taken do change quite rapidly. And there's other examples that we can kind of draw on from how to effectively do this. So I think the carpentries and program historian are two really nice examples of things that have been going for quite some time and have been able to kind of successfully deliver that community development of materials. There might also be a few kind of quick wins around discoverability that we suggest in the review document. Kind of getting back a little bit to this point about the kind of themes and the topics covered in the material, what we found is there was quite a bit of emphasis on this kind of part in the blue in this diagram. So the kind of here's how to train a model, but the kind of data that is required to train that model is taken a little bit as a given, but also how that kind of model sits more broadly within other processes or systems or kind of challenges around actually kind of getting to that point where you can train a model aren't always covered as much. So we kind of argue that we should broaden which parts of the machine learning pipeline are actually covered in the training material. In terms of the point I kind of mentioned about GLAM specific data, so most of the materials, as I said, had quite generic data sets, and that's probably quite practical in many cases, but we think it would be useful to try as far as possible to use GLAM specific examples in this training material, because a lot of the kind of particular challenges that come from applied machine learning in a GLAM context come from the kind of specific data that we work with. So again, that's not always easy to do, but I think that would make the teaching material a lot more relevant and useful for people. And the kind of final recommendation, which kind of touches also on this pipeline point, is that there's a lot of kind of challenges in effectively implementing machine learning within an institution and kind of managing machine learning projects. And those aren't kind of well covered in the teaching material that we reviewed. And I would kind of suggest that they're not necessarily things that anyone has a kind of perfect idea of how to approach. So one suggestion that we make, which kind of follows some of the recommendations made in the previous reports that I mentioned, is to try and kind of foster more sharing within the kind of GLAM sector of machine learning projects. So to try and kind of document in probably slightly overly detailed way the various kind of decisions that were made in that project, things like how the data was gathered, which labels were chosen, how the data set was collected, where the annotations came from, how that process was carried out. So this would probably be a slightly more informal resource for people to learn from, but might actually be kind of more useful in terms of actually getting people from the stage where they're interested in using machine learning to being able to adopt it in a kind of more practical way within their institution. So in terms of the next steps with this review, the first thing we'd like is feedback on the document and the kind of materials we reviewed. We'd also love more people to join the teaching and learning working group. And finally, we're also planning at some point this year to still have kind of meeting based on this review, where we kind of think a little bit more about next steps and how we kind of might take some of the kind of recommendations further. So it'd be really great to have more input from people on that. So I've gone over time a little bit, but this is just some of the links. I think most of those are probably familiar to people already, but just in case, that is hopefully useful. I think that's me.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Since we have a pretty slim agenda this week, I think we can do questions right now for Daniel, if anyone has them, or we can also, as always, put them in the notes document. Does anyone have any questions, or what questions do people have about the document or the process?
Hi, this is Abby Potter. Thanks. That was really useful, and I think really I like the view you took of it as sort of comprehensive, not just training, but sort of absorbing the whole this whole sort of new field of or sort of new way of doing work. And I just wondered if you all had thoughts on like if people in your organizations are asking, like, okay, how do we get this going? How do we start this? What would you say after having done all this sort of research? Like, I want to, like, should we hire 3 people? Should we you know, what should we, like, what would you do? Like, what would you do if somebody said that to you?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I don't think we discussed it that much as a group. I would have my own kind of hot take, which would, I mean, I think there's a danger of kind of outsourcing too much of this to say, like, let's just get people in who either as kind of external collaborators or hire people with kind of machine learning skills. And I think there is, you know, need for that kind of work, but I think it is that kind of deep domain expertise that kind of is really required, not just in a kind of nice, warm, fuzzy way, but to actually make this stuff work in practice and be useful. So I think, yeah, my emphasis would really be about, you know, trying to provide opportunities for people who want to do this kind of work to kind of learn how to do that. And I guess, you know, some of that is around these kind of more formal teaching resources. And I think, you know, there's opportunities for going through kind of more generic training materials that already exist. But then I guess there's the kind of more informal learning experience of like setting up some kind of project, which is maybe like slightly more limited in scope and a little bit more yeah, constrained in what it's trying to do, and actually go through all of those steps. Because I think, you know, it's when you actually go through the process of like, okay, how are we going to get this data? And then, oh, these labels like don't make any sense. And I think that's like probably where you tend to learn more than, you know, in a kind of very nice classroom setting where everything kind of fits together quite neatly and you end up with a model that performs really well. And so I think, and that's obviously quite a big ask because that's not particularly efficient in terms of time, but I think that would be kind of very useful, I think.
Abby, perhaps to add to this, I agree, we didn't talk about this much in the group, but we had Nora McGregor talking to us in one of our working group meetings. And there's a video, she talks a little bit about British Library. And Daniel, I don't know if you have any add to this, you know her a little better, but that, you know, the local sort of a, you know, kind of how you can organize locally in small groups and just get conversations going. I think that might be interesting as a, I don't know if you know about this, but it might be interesting. I put the link to the recording in the chat.
Yeah, that would, I think that's a good point actually, because that I think would be a probably slightly more pragmatic solution that like let everyone get stuck into a machine learning project. So yeah, I think there's a few different initiatives that Nora mentions, and one of those is something called like Hack and Yaks, where you know, people who are interested in a particular topic get together for a couple of hours and work through some existing materials in quite an informal way. But I guess the idea is that you kind of over time develop a cohort of people who kind of know each other and develop their skills, but can also ask each other questions. And I guess that's slightly easier to facilitate than being like, okay, here's like a 12-week course that we're running for everyone. That, yeah, that might be a bit too much work for a lot of institutions.
And to add one more comment on that question is, in the spreadsheet, one of the columns is for audience stick figures, and the explanation of that is we kind of tried to come up with I don't know, theoretical types of people who would be interested in the training. So if there are additional people in there, that would be like a really great people who could be served by going through any one of these training courses. That would be a great contribution in addition to adding additional resources.
I have a different question or comment, Mike, if okay. Yeah, okay. I didn't want to cut off discussion there. Daniel, thank you. This has been a great presentation, and this group's work is really substantial. This is, I think, a great contribution in organizing a lot of disparate information. What I'm struck by the some of the discussion started by Abby's last question, which is that the learning through projects is so key. It's not enough to just read about it. It's not enough to just throw some code around. And in your section 4, it emphasizes that. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the best way to construct projects or make it easy to bring projects in as part of the experiential learning.
I guess there's like 2 points that I would kind of make. So I think in terms of like documenting projects that people are already doing, I mean, I think because people are doing such different things, it's hard to come up with like a template of what they would document. But I think trying to, as a community, develop some kind of like, here's like things that would be useful to know when you kind of document a project for other people would be a kind of useful starting point. Yeah, in terms of initiating projects, I guess it's like very specific to the institution. But yeah, one thing I've kind of had vague ideas about is whether there's also opportunities as a kind of, yeah, some kind of study group type thing for people who might be interested to kind of go through the process of doing a project together with, you know, some constraints, but, you know, through all the stages and like, okay, what data set are we going to use? How are we going to annotate it? Like, how are we actually going to collect those annotations? But I think the other thing, which I don't think is really discussed that much in the document, is in thinking about like where these projects are going to kind of sit within an existing workflow or kind of business process, if that's the goal, if it's not kind of research focused. I think that there's quite often a danger of kind of getting overly excited about the kind of automated decision-making part, and then kind of you place a lot more like risk and kind of need to be right on the project if you do it that way. So I think picking some kind of project where the end result is kind of flagging something to a human who can then kind of do whatever with it, I think kind of makes it a lot more straightforward to have a successful project, because the kind of measure of success isn't like, oh, we're confident in this making automated decisions for us. The measure is more like, oh, is this kind of useful for a human working on a particular task in doing their work? And I think that's probably easier for institutions to achieve than like the more automation side of things.
Did you encounter any examples of like a project in a box, which is sort of a project that's ready to go, where maybe there's already training data or an untrained data that's ready to consume? I'm struck by 4.6 with GLAM specific training data would improve teaching and learning, for example.
Not at the moment. I mean, there's some work we're doing on living machines, which will be a little bit in this vein. So there's this kind of data set of books, digitized books, which at the moment don't have genre labels attached. And the kind of work we've done on the project is to assign genre labels to those books. So that work is kind of trying to be set up as like a process you can kind of follow stage by stage. But again, it's still like a little bit artificial because things will be a little bit in place. But yeah, I think trying to come up with some of those projects that people could potentially go through in a kind of meaningful way, but without it being like a massive undertaking would be, yeah, I think could be a really useful thing for the community to work on.
I think another interesting aspect about this project work is that there are different roles within each project, different people working together to make things happen. And so just thinking about how communication might work, how you might come to common vocabularies, how you might understand each other a little bit. And Nicole and I taught a workshop, and what we were trying to address just this aspect. We had the people and the students' attendants engage in role play. So we really gave them instructions, and they had to group, take on different hats, the curator, the programmer, etc. And we put them with little challenges. Now, this was a very small exercise, but what it did do is to point to some of these different kind of cultures or constraints that people work under, you know, to make such a larger project happen. So again, this is just a small aspect of the whole thing, but I thought, you know, it's worth thinking about for exploring.